Thank you very much for the invitation, Tony and Noel-Ann. So I'm Florian from the University of Bristol, and I was asked to try and defend a bit the case of exams, to kind of argue why there is still some benefit in keeping exams. So before I get to the matter at hand, I thought it'd be useful for me to kind of explain a bit of my experience of exam, because I think my experience likely introduce some biases of why I think exams still have their place. So when I was a student, I was kind of one of those that didn't really stress about exam. In fact, I actually stressed more on the day of the result. Waiting for the result was more stressful. Exam, I didn't have any worries about it. Although I will point out that I don't think I was good, but I wasn't by any means excellent at exam. I was very prone to making silly mistake. I kind of confused word and sometimes definition. And I found it very hard to proofread my work in the exam, which means that actually I got a decent marks, but by no means anything amazing. As a lecturer, I'm a lecturer in pure mathematics. I have done a course in algebraic number theory, a fourth-year course, where 80% of the mark come from a final exam and 20% coursework. I've done a course on Introduction to Pure Mathematics, which is a first-year course. 90% of the exam come from 90% of the mark come from the final exam. Although that's with a much larger number of students, 400 students taking that first year course. I also kind of wanted to highlight that I also do a unit called Mathematical Investigation, which is 100% coursework. So I'm not a stranger to alternative form of assessment. I'm not going to talk about mathematical investigation, but for those interested, it is a unit that involves group work, presentation, peer marking, research report writing, and even a bit on CV writing and interviews. And finally, I'm also the senior tutor for year one within the School of Mathematics, which means, among many other things, that I have conversation with students who need extra support and regarding any assessment in general. So I get to see how anxious different students can be. I try to support them. I try to point out the right resources. I have conversation with students on alternative to the upcoming exam if needs be, and also end up speaking to students who end up failing exams, or students who struggle with their studies or transitioning to university life, no matter what reason is. So that kind of, I think, gives me also a bit of an insight of what goes on with maybe the student who struggle the most. And I guess I should also point out that I'm aware that I'm privileged. I know I'm white, male-ish, not so young anymore, straight passing. So whilst speaking to students, I have an idea. Speaking to various students, I have an idea what they may be going through. I know I don't know the true extent of the hardship they go. So, I do understand that I've got some bias in what I say. So, to clarify exam, for this talk, I'm going to consider exam to be any individually written test taken in an exam room, so controlled environment, invigilated. I am going to be talking both about exams that are open book, so allow notes or the supportive material, and exams that are closed book. And to set the scene, Tony can already mentioned this before, but closed book exams are still the main form of assessment in university maths in the UK. This was a study done by Paola Ione and Andrew Simpson, who did a survey both in 2012, who found the same result, and a recent survey in 2021 of the department, and found that closed book exams are still the main form of assessment. Similarly, they did two studies in 2014 to look at what students and lecturers' preferences are for assessment. And interestingly enough, both set of groups found closed book exam came up to the top of the list. Another bit of interest here is open book exam came third for the student. They're quite high up, but academic didn't find it as the preferred method of assessment as much. However, slight caveat, I recognize that these are studies that were done over 10 years ago. The landscape has changed a lot in the last 10 years with COVID, take-home exam. So it'd be quite interesting to actually see if the same results are reproduced nowadays. But however, it is quite clear that the closed book exam benefit from the status quo. But do they actually have any benefits? So let me first talk about a very weak argument, in my opinion, but I still think it's worth mentioning. There's a practical need for exam. Okay, in theory, the increase of students does not really increase the resources needed to run the exam. Well, it does increase it, but not linearly. Within our school, we've had our student number increase year on year. We haven't had that much of an increase of invigilation of exam. We've had an increase of alternative exam arrangement that I'll talk in a bit. And depending on the timescale you have of your marking, Tony mentioned that our marking deadline comes shorter and shorter. But the advantage of exam is it's very easy to spread it amongst many markers who can all mark a question. So in theory, there is still some consistency because every marker can mark horizontally and all mark the same question. The one that I think might be the one thing I want to talk a bit more about is the setting up fair, which might have some controversy in what I say. So there are many skills we want our students to learn and display to show that they're a good mathematician, such as mathematical communication skills, both written and spoken. We want to show them. We want to get them to show us their research skills. We want to show them to show their teamwork skills. We want them to display problem-solving skill, mathematical ability. There's quite a fair few things we want to do. And what I think the strength of exam is well that there are many types of assessment where students can showcase their mathematical imagination and understanding, for example, through problem sheets, project, quizzes. Exam does it in a controlled environment. Now, as it's been pointed out quite a few times now, I am not claiming that cheating cannot take place in exam. That certainly can happen. But what I will say is that because of this controlled environment, it is easier to assess students' individual cognitive process via the exam. It is not modeled up with any collusion or usage of various resources, whether that's AI, library books, or all that. Now, I should also point out that the later skills are useful skills still to teach our students. We do want to teach our students to work with others, share resources. We do want to teach our students to use AI in a responsible manner. But the benefit of exam is that it does test an individual's problem-solving skill and critical thinking skill within mathematics. In fact, I kind of also want to argue that looking at the exam scripts allows you to see the raw thought of a student on how to think. It's very much of an unfiltered thought. Compared to problem sheet, where they would be reworking on, well, in theory, we encourage our students to be reworking on draft until they have a very well-communicated set of solutions, which teach them another skills. But I think seeing that raw sort of students allows us to really see how they think, how they problem solve, and what their mathematical creativity and critical thinking is like. Yep. All right, I went too far off. There was, so in Paula's and Andrew's paper, both student and lecturer commented that it is for the reason I kind of listed that they see exam as a good discriminator of mathematical abilities. Although from that quote, I want to take that mathematical ability in the very narrow sense. As I said, the exam don't test all the skills a good mathematician needs. But one thing I want to point out is, as has been touched before, some students think that closed book exam are mostly test how good a student is at memorizing, which brings me up to the next point about revision, open book and closed book exams. We've kind of touched upon in the previous talk that in theory, well, if an exam is badly set, you could just be very good at memorizing it and passing the exam purely through memorization. Now, I like to think that as academic, we try to pass the message that exams are not meant to test memorization, but understanding. I like to think that a good exam should really be testing those mathematical skills. I haven't really defined what a good exam is, but for example, in some of my exams, I will have a question of, here's a proof, either tell me what's wrong with it or explain to me how they go from that step to that step, kind of a bit of critical thinking, not necessarily, replicate, a calculation you've seen before or that you've done many times before. So this is where open book exam comes in, because they will help a student, well, in theory, open book exam reassure students that they don't need to memorize it mitigate the cognitive load for memorization because they can bring in their notes in. Now, before I talk about a quick experience, our experiences of open book exam at the University of Bristol, this page, let me talk about one advantage of exam, whether open book or closed book, which is about the revision that goes into it. Now, I know there's the feeling that sometimes students just revise at the last minute, and we shouldn't encourage them to be revising throughout their unit and throughout their year. But one potential strength of exam is the work that students have to put in to prepare for them. By not knowing what they will be tested on, student needs to look at the unit as a whole. Hopefully that encourage them to take a step back and try to see how everything fits together, and hopefully encouraging them to put linking different parts of this unit and maybe other units. Problem sheet in theory can encourage them to link certain bits before, but by having the question beforehand, that they know more what to concentrate on. Here, the unknown allows them to try and concentrate on everything, see how everything fits together. There's an argument that for some students, the crux of their learning happen during the revision, that until they are forced to revise, they kind of just get along with the lecture notes and the problem sheet and don't really take time to think about it. And therefore, the exam kind of forces them to actually think about how everything fits together, think about learning everything and making sure they understand. Now, this does rely on how students approach revision. A student who revising as many past papers as possible is very unlikely to reach the same level of understanding or make any connection as someone who have different method of revision, which I'll talk in a bit. So I think it's important that we also teach students how to revise and help them prepare for exam in the same way that we teach them how to prepare for a presentation if you've got a presentation, or we teach them how to research or write a report before their project is due. And part of this way of revising, I think, is kind of illustrated with our experience of what happened with open book and closed book exam at Bristol. So once the University of Bristol moved back to in-person exam in COVID 2019, we had open book exam. What we did is we allowed students to take in 4 pages of A4 note with them to the exam and asked them to include their notes in their exam script. What we found is that many students did not know how to make effective notes for exam. We saw some students reproducing the entire content of a course as small as possible to fit on those 4 pieces of paper. We also saw some people bringing solution to problem sheets or even past papers. And what we observed is that while students who were getting 60% or more continued to receive similar marks, weaker students, shall I say, were getting worse mark on average. And what we think, we haven't actually been able to verify this, but what we think happened is because students who did not know how to revise were spending a lot of time and effort making these notes at the cost of revising it. They didn't realize that the notes should be a byproduct of their revision rather than replacing the revision. And this may be a failure on our part of not teaching them this. And as a result, so we did this for 2 years, and then last year we only allowed 1 page of A4 notes, and the overall average of each exam actually increased. And this year, we decided that year 1 and year 2 exam would not allow notes, so we went back to closed book exam for this year. However, to help them with this idea that it shouldn't be a memorization test, we encouraged lecturer to include a formula sheet in the exam. And if they did that, they had to share that formula sheet with a student 6 weeks before the exam. So this job reassures students that the exam is not about memorization. And when we met with the student, or when my colleague Rachel, senior teacher for year 2, met with the student, the year 2 student, who was the only one who experienced both open book and closed book exam, they said they found the exam with that note went better than expected, but even better, they even say they felt they understood the material better. So as much as I wanted to be a big believer of open book exam, I think experience showed that maybe this hasn't worked because we're not teaching them the skill on how to revise in a way. Oops. Let me move on to wellbeing and inclusivity, because that's kind of the main topic, as has been reported quite a few times. High-stake assessment increased stress. And while in theory, stress has been found to be a good motivator for some study, not everyone's affected the same way. In particular, we do have students who don't perform as well due to stress, anxiety, panic attack in exam. And this is not even considering students who might be affected by other exceptional circumstances outside their control, or simply, for example, simply cannot get a good night's sleep, bereavement in the family. The problem with exam is not just the high stress, but it's also the fact that it takes place at a set time. And as we mentioned before, that can also affect different groups differently. But these problems do affect any kind of assessment that takes place under time conditions. So it won't be just exam, but it'd be anything like presentation that has to take place on a set day, whether it's a group presentation or not. And we cannot mitigate all these possible situations, but we do need to be inclusive with our assessment and consider students' well-being. This one, yeah. Sorry, I keep having two screens there, so it's getting a bit confusing. Now, exams are seen to be the least expensive form of assessment, and that report that paper that Nick mentioned had that conclusion. However, it's important to know that the usage of alternative exam arrangement can help exam being inclusive. But what I mean by alternative exam arrangement is allowing extra time, allowing rest breaks, allowing students to be in smaller venues, having exam printed on different type of paper, different font, and all of that. As a side note to this, at Bristol, we're now aiming to give some standard alternative exam arrangement to any students who self-declare they need it. So we are going to try and be more inclusive by just allowing students to choose if they need those extra arrangement. This said, exam setters should be mindful of the inclusivity of the question they set. They need to make sure that the question they set don't rely on student having a certain background. They need to make sure they're phrased in an easy to pass way. They need to allow students who make mistake, including calculation mistake if you've got a calculation question, if they make a mistake early on, to be able to continue. And critically, they should make sure the exams are not too long for the time given so that students have a chance to complete them. All students work at a different rate, and in theory, exams should not be a test of how fast you can complete stuff. Now, going back to student preference for exam, it is worth noting that quite a few of our students do pick maths. I'm going to talk about Bristol here at least. Quite a few of our students do pick maths because they were good at it, but often it means that they were good at maths exam. So these students do tend to find exam. These kind of students tend to find exam less stressful than unknown and new form of assessment. Although again, I think this is more of an argument of what we need to support the student with any new form of assessment. But similarly, I've seen students who are extremely anxious about any other form of assessment, such as presentation or examination, group work. All of these, I had to work with these students to either support them with that form of assessment or even arrange for a different form of assessment than the one that were meant to take place. So I'm going to make a controversial statement that I think I don't quite fully believe in the way I phrased it, but I'm going to conclude that from an inclusive and well-being point of view, exams are not inherently worse than other form of assessment, or the alternative needs to be found, more form of assessment. I think the main problem is the high-stake part, which we can control, and to a certain degree, the fact that exam takes it as a set place. Right, cautious of time, let me quickly talk about some potential support. So, as well, needing support during the assessment with alternative exam, we need support throughout this before the assessment as they prepare. So I will argue that students come to university with a preconceived notion of how to revise for exam. However, not all students have the same preconceived notion. So we need to teach them, whether that's through a unit that incorporates study skills, how to have certain study skills, but even better, have more than one unit that teaches those study skills so they know that the study skill they learn from one unit should be applicable to all units. I'll miss that anecdote. So I mentioned that our first year student do a unit called mathematical investigation, which teaches those skills such as revision. There is a session on how to revise and approach exam. It goes through common techniques such as to find key point of approve, how to produce a good set of revision note, how to produce a mind map, and a reminder that going through problem sheet are better than going through past paper, and in particular going through problem sheet and marking your own work from the solution given. However, there's no assessment linked to this, and the session is actually done at the end of term. The students who benefit from the session often don't turn up. There's also a tendency for students to think those skills are only linked to that unit, which is why I said we need to link them to the unit. Two things that came to mind as I was writing this slide is that during the workshop on designing assessment for student wellbeing that Tony and Noel-Ann facilitated, I saw a talk by Wodu Manjin from Sheffield who described how she did a summative assessment where students would produce a mind map, get a feedback on it and a mark, and then had a chance to resubmit it. I think a similar idea could be extended to other revision skills in general. In an extent, this is what we're already doing with assessed problem sheet. We're asking them to do problem so that they're prepared for exam. But I think it'd be nice to try and see if there's other skills we can try and have summative assessment to encourage students to do that. And in a similar vein, I wanted to point out that I've got a colleague, Asma Hazanat, who has decided to allow students, has decided this year that all formative work for a unit will not be marked, so the students don't get any feedback on it. Students should be marking it themselves, and then when they receive the solution a week later, and then if they want feedback on how they mark or want feedback on whether their marking is different to the solution and all of that, then they submit that bit. So then they've got feedback on their marking, which would help them understand all of this. Right, being cautious of that time, let me quickly touch briefly about oral exam. I think I don't have much experience with oral exam, but I think oral exam, from what I understand, like written exams, assess student individual cognitive process as well. Even better than a written exam, the question can be adapted to the student as they answer. And in a paper, in a 2013 paper, students did rate oral exam as the best form of assessment to test understanding that was above closed book exam. Interesting enough, in that same paper, student ranked closed book exam as the better assessment for differentiating students' mathematical ability. So again, they see mathematical ability as not just math understanding, but as well maybe a bit of memorization. The only problem with oral exam, I think I saw it actually discussed in the chat, is it might be quite hard to scale at a high level with a high cohort, especially if you got if you only want one examiner. And the main thing that I will point out is we do have students who get very anxious about presentation and oral exam. That alternative need to be found anyway for them. Whether that's, well, yeah, I'm not going to talk about how we'll get alternative for that bit. So to quickly conclude, I think it's quite clear that we need a varied assessment diet. We can't just have exam, but I think exam have a place in them. And I think a varied assessment diet will mean that we can have assessment feeding into other. So some assessment train some skill that they can test in other assessments. And the main advantage for exam is really to see that raw sort, that cognitive sort about how student problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills. And based on this, I think that it might be worth thinking that exams are better at the start of uni with a lot of other assessment, and then later we have smaller classes, switch to oral exam to replace and reduce the amount of kind of exam, both oral and written exam. But no matter what we do, it is important that we support students both at the start of the degree on how to kind of really approach things and make sure that they're supported both in the preparation and during the assessment. I'm going to stop there due to time.